Week, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Alex Jahangir, orthopedic trauma surgeon at Vanderbilt, who became the head of the Metro Coronavirus Task Force as well as during this period of time, and now is author of Hotspot, a doctor's diary of the pandemic the first year. Welcome. Nice to see you again.
Thank you so much. Really good to be here.
It's really nice to listen to your and read your book. I finished it very quickly. It really is a view of that first year of the pandemic when we were all working without a net. And it also talks a lot about your background. It kind of introduces you to us, you know, immigrating to this country when you were 6 from Iran with your family, an MLK magnet school grad, Vanderbilt grad, left Nashville, came back to Nashville. I want to start with, I think is a metaphor throughout this book that you start. I want to start with a phrase by orthopedic surgeons, apparently, that all bleeding stops. Now, that can mean different things. It can be good and can be bad. What do you mean it is?
Well, exactly what you said. You know, I think anytime that in surgery that you do have a bleeding scenario, I think what's important to always remember that the bleeding will stop. The key is if you're doing your job right, the bleeding will stop because you've intervened and the patient survives. However, in moments in which you don't intervene or you're not thoughtful, obviously the patient can bleed out, and that's kind of, I think, the metaphor that held true for this past couple of years.
If all bleeding stops, what was the point in the pandemic where you realized this is bad?
Well, I think there's probably multiple points. Initially, obviously the first many months, we were all anxious about, I mean, gosh, we didn't know how this thing spread, how bad it could be. That first couple of weeks, I remember the mayor and I were presented with some modeling that showed about 2,800 Nashvillians were going to die in the next few months. 2,800 Nashvillians. And I remember at that moment we looked at each other, and that might have been one of the first times when we realized that this really could be bad.
What was the moment when you realized this country, this state, this city is not ready for this?
Well, you know, it was that very, very first week is when, you know, I think all of us realized that this is much bigger than we had planned. Mm-hmm. So as a health department, I'd been serving on the Board of Health since 2017 and served as the chair since 2019. We were following the pandemic, but really after the first case came here in Nashville, which again, none of us were surprised it came here, what I think surprised all of us is that first week, we went from, yeah, there's a case here and a woman who went to Massachusetts,
right,
to all of a sudden hundreds, if not thousands of people were getting ill, and we didn't have a way to even figure it out, much less know how to treat it. And I think it was that very first week, and I think why Mayor Cooper initially recognized that he needed more than just the health department involved. Rather, he needed somebody in me to kind of look at the whole of Metro government, the whole of city and private-public partnerships to help us get through this.
We did respond. You were named the head of the Coronavirus Task Force. You were building a bridge with no directions. This had never happened before. You had some doubts about yourself, being an orthopedic surgeon, not a virologist, as it were. What was the first step? Where did you start? You needed to set up testing. You needed to set up response teams, hospital beds. Where did you begin?
As we all saw during this pandemic, information changed almost hourly. Yep. And so being able to respond to all the information, helping kind of navigate what is true information, what has changed, why it's changed, and trying to keep being an honest voice for people to rely to was critical. So one of the very first things that I asked for was to help around communications, and so we started building a communications team. Concurrent to that, with the Office of Emergency Management and with our health systems, working on making an invisible enemy visible through testing. And if you remember that early on, gosh, there was no testing anywhere in the country. We saw places in Colorado. I remember sitting in the Office of Emergency Management on the big screens behind us, seeing hour-long lines in Colorado driving testing sites. And so what we needed to do is we knew we didn't want to do that. And so when we came to build testing sites, bringing in our health systems and our experts who had been independently, each health system and each entity had a plan for COVID. It just wasn't coordinated. And so bringing all those entities together and coordinating them was one of the first things we did, besides communications, I think gave us a lot of success.
Were you surprised it became political as quickly as it became? Were you surprised with the Trump administration denying it, calling it a hoax, proposing untested treatments, rejecting science? How hard did that make that communications process?
Yeah, I think it was. I think there was a major flaw at the federal level initially about how this was communicated. You know, Vice President Pence early on, people don't remember this, had a regular press conference and had a very, what appeared to me to be a very systemic way of approaching this in a proper way, right? Not too exciting, but brought all the information, reported it. And so that was the right way to approach it, right? But yeah, whenever it became more of a show, for lack of a better word, in which things were just said, and you know, the presidency is a powerful position, and all of us in moments of crisis look to the presidents, right, irrespective of party. And I think it did not help when right at the beginning, President Trump did just start saying things, and I think that led people to believe certain things, act a certain way. It's not to say the entire federal response was a flaw. You know, I think Operation Warp Speed and how quickly vaccines came was an important thing. It's not to say that this current federal response doesn't have its own problems. But early on, when we should have all been united, I mean, look at moments of crisis, such as, for example, September 11th, how much we all came around together and got big things done in this country. This pandemic could have been that moment early on, and I think it was a failed opportunity.
A conversation with Dr. Alex Jahangir will continue. He's author of Hotspot, A Doctor's Diary from the Pandemic. Stay with us. This Week continues in a moment. Welcome back to This Week in my conversation with Dr. Alex Jahangir, author of Hotspot, A Doctor's Diary from the Pandemic, as he headed up the coronavirus task force. There were two revealing incidents in your book. One involved you as you, halfway through the pandemic, were driving into a news conference and pulled over and broke down into tears. Another involved your three children who had been dealing with online education and dealing pretty well, but missing their friends, who all three at the same time broke down in your house. These, to me, were real examples of the stress that everybody was feeling at the time.
Yeah, you know, the episode of breaking down or crying, which is not something I typically do. I mean, I think I'm a very stereotypical surgeon in a way.
Sure.
But it was a Sunday, and I was driving up 12 South from my house, and that's a place we go a bunch of times with our family. We get ice cream, pizza. But this Sunday, it was eerily quiet. And it was quiet because, again, we had just, you know, I had asked everyone to stay home. But there was no formal safer at home order. And I knew we were driving to the press conference to announce the safer at home order. And it just, I think all the emotions, what all that means, and the fact that there's so much uncertainty just got to me. And it was just a moment of realizing this, I was such a small piece of this really heavy thing that was hitting all of us.
You had to make tough decisions. The safer at home order was one of those, effectively a lockdown of the city. It was pushed back on by businesses downtown. It was ignored by some people. At the time, you thought it was the right thing to do. It was saving lives. It was protecting people from the pandemic. How tough was it to make those calls as people were criticizing you personally, criticizing the decision, saying that you had no right, that this was my personal decision?
In short, it was tough, but here's the thing. The mayor, at the very first time he and I sat down and talked about this response, said, look, if you approach this, always letting the science lead, being transparent with the public, and being honest with him, that's the right way to approach it. And whatever happens from there, as long as we stand by those three principles, we're going to be okay. And so, again, 2,800 people were expected to die within a few months when we did safer at home order. We were starting to see downtown Broadway that day before the safer at home order just be like it always is. And we knew already at this point, when places like Chicago and New York had already shut down, that this was transmitting quickly amongst that group, a group that may not be effective. They would go home and affect their parents and their loved ones who may be more at risk. And so I still believe those were the right decisions at the time. I think as vaccines became more readily available and everyone was able to get a vaccine when they needed one, then I do think at that point you have personal responsibility. Part of a society, though, is you may have to make certain sacrifices when it's in the greater good. And at that time, I still believe that was in the greater good.
There were times, especially late in the pandemic, that Tennessee was the worst in the nation for cases, for new cases, hospitalizations. How do you view the state's response? I think the governor initially set up unified command, got Dr. Piercy going, did a great job responding, but I think it waned. I think the political pressure got to him. I think there was an awful lot of pushback from folks who were denying this, didn't want to be locked down. There was never a statewide mask mandate. The governor never did that, no statewide mandate for vaccines or anything like that. Did those decisions hurt? Did it make it harder?
Well, I think that early on, gosh, the state was such an amazing partner to us. You know, Dr. Piercy, General Brower, you know, Patrick Sheehan, amazing. And the governor himself, actually, our testing sites in Nashville were only able to open when the governor literally flew to Memphis and brought 3,000 swabs from Memphis for us to get the testing sites off. What the governor also did is, and as he's, I think, explained, is, he gave autonomy to the individual counties to make certain decisions around mask mandates. And again, I think that had served us as a city well. Could have had a statewide mask mandate if it was able to really be effective and be able to be enforced. Would it have been helped? I don't know. But I think the bigger challenge here is around vaccinations. And I think the politicization of this process at all levels really became a problem. Right now, if you look at the unvaccinated, there's a 3-to-1 ratio of unvaccinated people who are Republicans to Democrats. And the fact that Republican or Democrat is a demographic we're talking about and who's vaccinated, to me, is really an amazing and almost absurd demographic we're talking about.
Did you learn about the resiliency of this city and this state through this pandemic? In regards to what I'm going to say is that there's a point in your book where you talk about a body can withstand one assault. A second assault can sometimes be fatal. It can't respond. And when the explosion happened on Christmas morning, you thought that was the second assault on the city that maybe the city couldn't respond to. We got through it. We got through this pandemic. It was painful. What did those lessons learn? What did you learn from those?
Well, as somebody who moved to the city from a war-torn country at age 6, and now I'm raising my own kids here, what was most amazing to me is all the people, both in the private sector, in the public sector, just people in the grocery store, who really want this city and I would say the state to succeed. And it gave me a lot of hope. And so despite the few moments of the naysayers, I think overall I leave this experience with a lot more hope in our city and state.
As you leave the experience, there's going to be another pandemic down the road. Are we better prepared for when the next attack happens, whether it's a variant of this pandemic or a new pandemic?
I hope so. I think there are lessons that we have all learned that will be able to be brought forward. Here's the one thing I do have a worry about. There's certain tools we had available to us early on that are no longer available to us because of the politicization of this, right? And so the emergency public health order for the city of Nashville at the time was signed by me as the chair of the Board of Health. Authority no longer sits with me. It sits with the mayor, which I think is as long as the governor has declared a public health emergency. And I think in our city we will probably always have a mayor that will let the science lead. But I think that gives me some pause for the future. But I hope that part of the reason I wrote the book is so we kind of have a memory of what has happened, and hopefully long term we'll have a good response if we have to have one of these again. Dr.
Alex Jahangir, author of Hotspot, A Doctor's Diary from the Pandemic. Thanks you very much for your time and your insight. Well, it's a good read. Stay with us. This week continues in a moment.